friends, and welcome to a brand new program here on Armstrong Cable Channel 4, a new program titled Chapters, where we profile local authors, writers, and publishers in our community, both in Huntington, Ohio, and throughout the Tri-State community. I'm Eliot Parker, your host for the program. We're delighted to have you with us, and we're delighted to have an exceptional local author with us here today, and we're going to spend some time talking with her about her poetry and her fiction, and that is Laura Bentley. And before we bring Laura into the conversation, just to tell you a little bit about her, she is a novelist, poet, and now book editor at West Virginia Living magazine, and she's had poetry published in the United States and in Ireland. She was born in Hagerstown, Maryland, although she's lived most of her life in Huntington, West Virginia. She's been a teacher for the gifted in West Virginia and has also taught in Kentucky. She's also taught as an adjunct professor at Marshall University, and in 1994 she received a fellowship award for literature from the West Virginia Commission of the Arts. And it's my pleasure to introduce and welcome to our first episode of Chapters, poet and novelist Laura Bentley. Laura, thank you so much for being with us. It's delighted to have you.
Oh, my pleasure. Thanks, Eliot.
So let's talk a little bit, before we get into poetry and fiction as genres, talk to us a little bit about writing, how you came to be a writer, what got you interested in writing. Is this something that you'd always had a knack for, or something that maybe you discovered later on in your career? Because you've taught for a long time and have a lot of teaching experience. Mm-hmm. When did you decide or realize that you were going to be a writer?
I probably fell in love with writing at Marshall. I had played around with poetry in high school and had the teenage angst kind of poems. I think I wrote those in notebooks, and I think I wrote my very first poem in the 7th grade for a class assignment. I have it somewhere, but the reality of seeing my first poem in print at Marshall University in the student literary magazine, etc., which is still there. They still are putting out a publication every year. That kind of, a light bulb went off. I thought, I liked writing, and I loved writing those poems, but the one poem that they chose I really liked. And to see it in print for the first time, and to realize that other people might be reading it, and that maybe that was something that I would be good at. I don't know. You never know what sparks the interest in someone. But my mother was a big reader and all those things. But I think that was the moment at Marshall. And I still have a copy of that book. I should have brought it, of etc. The first poem in that was called The Leaf Man. So, fun to think back on that time.
And so really from that point forward, you've been writing poetry and really starting to hone your craft from that point forward?
Pretty much. I am a mother. I have 3 grandchildren, and I worked full-time, and I moonlighted at Marshall. So I managed to keep writing. Not tremendous amounts, but all through those years, when you are raising a family and working full-time, it's a different kind of situation. I didn't go up into some garret somewhere in Paris and write my heart out for 10 years. So I think that it stayed with me all of those years, and then it just kept growing, and always there. You're always fueling up for the next poem or the next novel. You're always noticing things, maybe even when you don't have a second, to write something down. And I've kept a journal since I was about 16. So I don't know if that qualifies, but that, to get your thoughts on paper and how you were thinking when you were a teenager. I've looked at it a couple times over the years. It's interesting to go back.
That leads me to another issue, and I'm sure you get asked this all the time when you do readings and you do presentations. And as a writer myself, I get this question a lot. Our writing processes, and you touched on, being a mother and having work responsibilities and family responsibilities. And I think a lot of us as writers fall into that. We're constantly balancing the need and the want to write with the responsibilities and things that we have to do to pay the bills and to keep our lives going. do you have a certain process when you have an inspiration to write something, a poem or working on a novel, and we'll show the covers of your books here in just a little bit and have you read some excerpts from those, but do you have a process? I know some writers, for example, write every day, and they set a certain time out every day to write. Some only can do it on the weekends, or some can only do it, at certain points throughout the year. What is your writing process? How do you sit down when you get the inspiration to write, and from draft to completion? What's your time frame?
Right. Well, a lot of my writing is journal based. It's interesting. If something stays with me that I have to write about it, oftentimes I'll start with just a real fast draft in my journal. And then I may not go back to it for a year or two. In the interim, I may write other poems, but maybe the one that I just wrote that day in my journal, the draft, I might go back a few years later and find that and start shaping it into a poem. Since I'm a poet, I have noticed, I've started thinking about this recently, I'm struck by image. Image usually draws me into a poem, and it also drew me into the silver tattoo. And sometimes the image is an actual physical image, and other times it's just a fleeting thing you might think about. But I almost always go back to image, and I think I'm image driven actually, once I get started. Some poems I can write rather quickly, but then I'm always tinkering with them. And when I submit poems to publishers, I tend to really, really get serious about every word, every line at that point, even more than I am already, which is a lot. And with the book, it took me a year or two to get a rough draft of this book. And then I was constantly revising and polishing and adding to it and changing and rearranging, and that went on for several years. So the time frame for this novel is probably 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, about 6 or 7 years.
Wow.
From the time that I started it with a short story. And the opening chapter started out as a short story that was inspired by image, and it was one of a photograph that I took in Dublin on Grafton Street of a busker or a street musician who was spray painted silver from top to bottom, and he was a statue, and then people would throw money into a bucket, and then he'd come to life and music would play, and he'd start blowing bubbles, and and then this little girl ran up to try to capture one of the bubbles, and it was just one of those lucky moments, when I was able to catch that moment or capture that moment. So it became a photograph I hung on my wall. Of course, I was looking at it maybe more than average because it was on my wall, but the image propelled me into the short story, and then the image kept me going through the whole book, actually. Other images along the way. But it's always fascinating, the genesis of somebody's work, whether it's real or not real, that kind of thing.
Absolutely. We'll have you read from one of your poems here in just a moment, but I had one more question I was going to ask you about poetry. As a teacher, and I teach English at Mount West Community and Technical College, and you've been a speaker at my classes many times over the last several years. Poetry is a very polarizing genre of literature. When I mention to students, and when you've mentioned to students, we're going to study poetry.
Right.
You either get people that, are really excited, or you get the students who just have the look of panic on their face.
Right.
And I don't think that's always true of other genres of literature, fiction and nonfiction and drama. Why do you think poetry is that way? Having written a lot of poetry and read a lot of poetry, why people either are really interested in poetry, not interested in poetry, and there's not a lot of people in the middle, it seems like. And of course, they can always be persuaded to like poetry, I think, after they get familiar with it. But it's just a very polarizing, people either have a very quick answer to poetry, that yes, I like it, or no, I don't.
Right. I think everybody starts out loving poetry as children. nursery rhymes and Dr. Seuss, and I think everybody loves the rhythm and the sound and even the rhyme, And then as they get older, unfortunately, I've seen this happen, and I try to fight it all the time, is that it's taught in school, and the poems that are taught are either too hard, or the teachers are afraid of them, or my experience is that of all the units that are taught in, middle school and high school, even college, sometimes that's the chapter that's skipped. Either the teacher doesn't feel comfortable, or if they do, sometimes it's way over the head of the students. And I think it's far too complex. I think that's the poet's fault. I know there's difficult poetry, and I appreciate difficult poetry, but to make someone, or hopefully make someone, fall in love with poetry, you need to find ones that they can identify with and talk about them, and let them feel your love for the poem, and bring in West Virginia poets and poets from Ireland, their work, that is, and maybe supplement what's in the textbook with poems that you love, or have the students bring in poets that they love or poems that they love. I think it's just too hard. And then it becomes, when you get to college, at least for me, poetry becomes something terrifying. Because the professor says, okay, here's a poem, and here's your essay test, and tell me what you think the poet meant, and tell me what the fourth stanza means. And sometimes it's so complex, or maybe I don't have enough background to attempt it, that fear sets in, and then everything shuts down, I think. So I think we need to work on that. I think we are. I think our former poet laureate, Billy Collins, made a huge difference, and pushed for accessible, not easy poetry, not silly poetry, but accessible, meaningful poetry. And he became hugely popular. Wonder why? Mm-hmm. People who hadn't read poetry up until that point suddenly said, I like that one, or I understand that one, or he made me laugh in that one. And of course, he's a wonderful presenter as well.
Absolutely.
So I think maybe in college, the professors or the in the education department have someone come in to teach poetry that loves poetry. Yeah. And I don't know, that I'm going on and on there, but yeah, those are my feelings.
Yeah. And I know you turned me on to Billy Collins as a poet.
Oh, okay,
I had not read him, and now I use a lot of his poems in my classes as well. And you're right, when people find accessibility, when they find an image or a theme or a language pattern in the poetry that they can connect with and identify with, I think that makes a much bigger impact on not only the poem itself, but as time goes on, their overall view of the genre.
Right.
And speaking of poetry, we'll take a moment and let you read from your collection, Lake Effect, a poetry collection that I've read many times over and over again. And one of the great things I think about your poets, or your poetry, and I think one of the great things our viewers will come to appreciate about your poems is, you always can learn something new every time you read your poems. And even though I've read Camden Park, or I've read some of the different poems in your collection many times, it still seems fresh every time that I read it. And so I think that's a great technique that you have. But I thought we'll turn it over to you for just a couple minutes and let you read some of your poetry from your collection, Lake Effect.
Okay. Since you mentioned Camden Park, that's the name of the poem, I'm going to read that one first. Emmylou Harris is singing. Her acoustic guitar vibrates from the outdoor speakers in the 90-degree heat. The overflow crowd is standing on grassless knolls like cattle balanced on the side of a hill. I've come to worship her heartfelt lyrics, have walked with the seasoned regulars past the Big Dipper, the Dodgem cars and the Pronto pup stand to this dusty fairground. I've paid my $1 like the rest. A father holds his expressionless child and listens with quiet country respect to Emma Lou sing. I'm just a poor wayfaring stranger, a-traveling through this world of woe. They hear more than I. Their eyes draw in her song like scripture. It is bread and water, body and blood. They do not smile, but clap unaffectedly for more. She knows these people, the proud poor, the miners, the ones who refuse handouts and travel miles beneath dark hills in a pickup to be here. She sings for them. I stand at the back, incidental. I can't stop staring at their faces, raw-boned, black and white pictures of Abe Lincoln, Anne Frank, old before their time, hungry for words.
Oh, that's wonderful. Fantastic.